Failure is not the enemy. It never was. The real enemy is the fear that sits quietly in our minds long before we even try. Think about it. How many times in life have you stopped yourself not because you actually failed, but because you imagined what would happen if you did? It's not the fall that hurts us the most. It's the way we picture the fall. Fear makes failure look bigger, scarier, more permanent than it truly is. I want you to pause and ask yourself this question. What would you attempt if you knew that failure wasn't fatal? What dream would you chase if you believed that falling short was simply part of the process, not the end of the story? Most of us never get to find out because we let fear do the driving. We let fear convince us that failure is the monster in the room. And because we believe that we play small, we hesitate, we hold back. But failure isn't a monster. Failure is a mirror. It shows us where we are and where we need to grow. It points out the gap between who we are today and who we're capable of becoming. That's not an enemy. That's a gift. Fear, on the other hand, is the liar. Fear tells us that if we fail, we'll be humiliated. If we fail, we'll lose respect. If we fail, it means we're not good enough. That's not true. Failure has never said that. Only fear has. I've seen this play out in so many lives. A young leader I once spoke with had an incredible idea for a business. He was passionate, creative, and he had everything it would take to bring it to life. But he never did, not because he didn't have the skills, not because he didn't have the resources, but because he was terrified of failing. He imagined the disappointment on his family's faces. He imagined his friends saying, "I told you so." He imagined all the worst case scenarios before he even started. And so he didn't. He let fear win. Years later, he still talks about what could have been. That's what fear does. It kills possibility before possibility even has a chance. Contrast that with another story. A woman I know started a company that collapsed within 2 years. On paper, you'd call it a failure, but when you talk to her, she doesn't call it that. She calls it her training ground. She says, "Those 2 years were the most valuable years of my life. I learned more in failure than I ever would have learned in success." And now, she runs a thriving organization built on the lessons she gained when things didn't work. The difference between her and the first person wasn't talent. It wasn't luck. It was simply that she didn't let fear make failure bigger than it was. She accepted the fall and used it as a stepping stone instead of a gravestone. The truth is, failure is neutral. It's neither good nor bad. It simply is. It's our perception of failure that determines what it becomes. If we view failure as proof of inadequacy, it destroys us. If we view failure as proof of effort, it builds us. The outcome is the same. We didn't get what we wanted. But the meaning we attach to that outcome is what shapes who we become. Fear will always try to assign the worst meaning. Fear whispers, "You failed, therefore you are a failure." But if you listen carefully, failure itself whispers something very different. "You failed, therefore you tried." Think of a child learning to walk. They stumble, they fall, they cry sometimes. But none of us looks at a child who falls and says, "Walking just isn't for you. Maybe you should give up." We understand that falling is part of learning. We cheer them on, we encourage them. We celebrate the attempt. Yet somewhere along the line, as adults, we lose that perspective. We start to believe that falling is shameful. We stop cheering for attempts and only reward perfect outcomes. That's not wisdom. That's fear shaping culture, and it ruins potential. The worst part of fearing failure is that it keeps us from ever discovering our true capacity. Every extraordinary breakthrough in history was born out of someone willing to fail first. Airplanes didn't come from people avoiding failure. They came from people who crashed prototypes again and again until something finally flew. Light bulbs didn't come from someone who was terrified of wasting time. They came from someone who failed thousands of times and still said, "I'm not done." Imagine if fear had stopped them. Imagine if they thought failure was the end. We'd still be sitting in darkness. But here's the paradox. The more we fear failure, the more we actually guarantee it. Fear makes us hesitate. Fear makes us underperform. Fear makes us play safe when boldness is required. And in playing safe, we miss opportunities, we miss growth, we miss the very things that could have propelled us forward. So in trying to avoid failure, fear actually drives us straight into it. This is why I say failure is not the enemy. Fear is. Fear shrinks our world. Failure expands it. Fear locks the door. Failure opens it. Fear says, "Don't try." Failure says, "Try again." Fear keeps you where you are. Failure takes you where you've never been. Which one sounds more like an enemy to you? The question then is, how do we quiet fear? How do we stop giving it so much power? It starts with reframing the story we tell ourselves. Instead of saying, "If I fail, people will think less of me," we say, "If I fail, I'll learn something nobody else knows." Instead of saying, "Failure means I'm not enough," we say, "Failure means I was brave enough to try." That simple shift changes everything. Suddenly, the fear loses its grip. Another way is to stop aiming for perfection and start aiming for progress. Perfection is fear's favorite weapon. It convinces us that unless everything is flawless, it's worthless. But progress is messy. Progress is full of stumbles. Progress embraces failure as a natural part of the process. When you fall in love with progress, failure loses its sting. It becomes data feedback information, not judgment. Finally, surround yourself with people who normalize failure. Fear thrives in isolation, but it shrinks in community. When you hear others share their stories of failure and what they gained from it, suddenly it doesn't feel so terrifying. You realize you're not alone. You realize failure isn't fatal. You realize it's just part of being human. So, the next time you feel fear rising, I want you to pause, breathe, and ask yourself, am I afraid of failing, or am I afraid of what I'll tell myself if I do? That's the real battle. It's not the fall. It's the fear of the fall. Once you strip away fear's lies, failure becomes something you can handle. It becomes something you can grow from. Because at the end of the day, failure will visit all of us. None of us escapes it. The only choice we have is whether we let fear turn that failure into a prison, or whether we let courage turn it into a passport. Fear will always exaggerate the pain of falling. But courage reminds us that the fall is never as devastating as we imagine. What devastates us is not the failure itself. It's the story fear tells about it. So let's stop treating failure like the enemy. Let's stop running from it. Let's stop hiding from it. Instead, let's face fear for what it is, an illusion that keeps us from living fully. And when we do, we'll discover something powerful. Failure was never the worst thing that could happen. The worst thing was letting fear convince us not to try. And when you finally see failure not as a monster but as a mirror, you'll stop fearing it. You'll start learning from it. You'll start growing through it. And that, more than anything, is how you avoid the worst part of failing. You realize that the true enemy was never the stumble. It was always the fear that kept you from taking the step in the first place. The worst part of failing is not the failure itself. It's not the mistake, it's not the loss, it's not even the embarrassment in the moment. The worst part of failing is the silence that follows. It's the isolation we feel when we believe we're the only one who fell. That's the part that breaks people. Not the stumble, not the misstep, but the loneliness that convinces us we're unworthy, we're different, we're excluded from the very community we once felt safe in. Failure doesn't destroy us. Shame does. Shame thrives in silence. When we fail, we often retreat, we hide, we don't tell anyone what happened because we're afraid of judgment. We convince ourselves that if people knew the truth, they'd think less of us. So we lock it away. We carry it alone. And in that silence, failure grows heavier than it ever needed to be. I've seen this happen countless times. A leader I once knew lost a major contract for his company. It wasn't because he was careless or unprepared. It was simply bad timing, bad circumstances, and forces outside his control. But when it happened, he withdrew. He stopped speaking up in meetings. He stopped taking risks. He avoided conversations with his team. It wasn't the contract loss that crushed him. It was the belief that everyone else would see him as a failure. He didn't share what happened, and because he didn't share, nobody could remind him of the truth, that he wasn't defined by one deal, that his worth didn't disappear with one setback. He sat in silence, and the silence was heavier than the failure itself. This is what happens when we keep our failures hidden. We build a prison with invisible walls. On the outside, we smile, we pretend everything is fine. On the inside, we're carrying the weight of shame. That's the real damage. Not the failure, but the belief that we must face it alone. Think about it. When was the last time someone told you about a failure of theirs, openly, honestly, without sugarcoating it? Chances are, when they did, you didn't think less of them. You probably thought, wow, they're human, they're real. They're just like me. Vulnerability doesn't push people away. It pulls people closer. But fear of isolation convinces us if we admit our failures, people will reject us. And so we choose silence. That choice, more than the failure itself, is what eats away at us. The irony is that failure is the most universal human experience. Everyone fails, everyone. There isn't a person alive who hasn't stumbled, who hasn't fallen short, who hasn't miscalculated or misunderstood or made a mistake. Yet it is also the most hidden human experience. We rarely see each other's failures because we cover them up. We present polished versions of ourselves, carefully curated highlights, stories of success. Social media has made this even worse. We scroll through endless streams of wins, achievements, celebrations, and when we're sitting in the quiet of our own failure, We believe we're the only ones. That's not true, but it feels true. And that feeling of being alone and failure is devastating. What if we shifted that? What if failure wasn't something to be whispered in private, but something to be shared in public? What if leaders talked about their failures just as much as their successes? What if organizations normalize conversations about mistakes instead of hiding them? Imagine the freedom that would create. Imagine how many people would stop carrying their shame in silence if they knew failure wasn't a disqualification, but a common thread that connects us all. I remember sitting with a group of young entrepreneurs. Each of them was building something they believed in, and one of them stood up and said, "I don't think I belong here. My first company already failed." You could hear the weight in his voice. He truly believed he was the only one in that room who had stumbled. And then one by one, the others started sharing their stories. My first 2 companies failed. I went bankrupt before this business. I launched a product that completely flopped. Within minutes, the entire room had shifted. What was once a lonely confession turned into a shared bond. That young man wasn't alone anymore. He realized failure was not his exclusion from the group. It was actually his initiation into it. This is why silence is the real enemy. Silence convinces us we're alone when we're not. Silence turns something normal into something shameful. Silence takes the most human experience and turns it into a secret. And the longer we hold that silence, the heavier it becomes. But the moment we speak it out, something powerful happens. The shame loses its grip. The weight lifts. The isolation disappears. Suddenly, failure is no longer a private burden, it's a shared experience. And in that sharing, it transforms from something that breaks us into something that builds connection. Think about every strong relationship you've ever had, whether with a friend, a mentor, or a colleague. Was that relationship built on pretending to be perfect? Or was it built on honesty, on vulnerability, on sharing the moments when things didn't go as planned? It's in those raw, unpolished moments that trust is born. Success impresses people. Failure connects people. And connection is what keeps us from being crushed by failure. The worst part of failing isn't falling short. It's believing that nobody else knows what it feels like. It's convincing ourselves that we're the only ones carrying this weight. That lie keeps people stuck. That lie convinces them to give up. That lie destroys dreams more than failure ever could. So how do we break that silence? We start by telling the truth. We stop pretending. We admit when we fall. And when we do, we discover something remarkable. People lean in. People don't reject us. They don't walk away. In fact, they trust us more. They respect us more. Because honesty is rare. Courage is rare. And when we speak openly about our failures, we give others permission to do the same. This is why some of the most powerful communities in the world are built not around shared success, but around shared struggle. Support groups, recovery circles, mentorship networks, these spaces thrive because people walk in carrying silence and walk out carrying connection. They realize they're not alone. And in realizing that failure becomes something survivable. If we truly want to avoid the worst part of failing, we have to create environments where failure can be spoken without fear, where failure is seen not as weakness, but as evidence of courage, where silence is broken by stories, by honesty, by vulnerability. Because the moment failure is brought into the light, it stops being a source of isolation and starts being a source of growth. And so the challenge is this: the next time you fail, resist the instinct to retreat, resist the temptation to go silent. Instead, share it. Speak it. Tell someone you trust. And if you're in a position of leadership, model it. Show others that failure isn't something to hide. Show them that failure doesn't disqualify them. Show them that failure makes them part of the human story we all share. Because when we break the silence, we break the power of shame. When we share our failures, we discover that others have been there too. And suddenly the isolation that once felt unbearable disappears. Failure becomes lighter. Failure becomes something we can carry together. At the end of the day, failure is inevitable. Silence is optional, and if we want to avoid the worst part of failing, we must choose connection over isolation, honesty over hiding, community over silence. Because the fall isn't what breaks us, it's the belief that we fell alone. And once we know we're not alone, we can stand up again stronger, braver, and ready to keep moving forward. One of the most dangerous mistakes we make in life is confusing what we do with who we are. When things go well, we say, "I am successful." When things don't go well, we say, "I am a failure." Notice the difference. It's just one word, but it changes everything. I failed is an event. I am a failure is an identity. And when we attach our identity to outcomes, every success inflates our ego and every failure destroys our self-worth. Think about the first time you achieved something significant. Maybe it was a grade in school, a job you wanted, a performance you nailed, Or a deal you closed, how did it feel? Probably amazing. You felt unstoppable. And without realizing it, a dangerous belief began to creep in. This result is who I am. Now flip the script. Think about the last time you didn't achieve what you hoped for. You didn't get the job. You missed the mark. You fell short of your own expectations. What did you tell yourself then? I'm not good enough. I don't have what it takes. The danger isn't in the outcome itself. The danger is in the meaning we attach to it. Failure is not an identity. Failure is an event. It's a chapter in the story, not the whole book. Yet so many of us live as though every outcome is a final verdict on our value as a human being. We let wins and losses tell us who we are. And in doing so, we hand over our identity to forces we can't fully control. That's a dangerous way to live because outcomes will always fluctuate. Some days we win, some days we lose. If our sense of self rises and falls with every outcome, then stability will always feel out of reach. I once met an athlete whose entire identity was tied to his sport. Every morning, every meal, every conversation was about competition, about winning. When he won, he felt invincible. When he lost, he spiraled into despair. And then one day his career ended due to injury. Suddenly he wasn't an athlete anymore, or at least that's what he believed without the outcome, without the wins. He felt like he was nothing. He didn't know who he was apart from the scoreboard. That's what happens when you attach your identity to outcomes. When the outcome disappears, so does your sense of self. Now let me tell you another story. A teacher I once spoke to told me something remarkable. She said, I measure my success not by my students' grades, but by the courage they have to keep asking questions. Notice the difference. If her identity was tied only to test scores, she would have been devastated when students struggled. But she had detached her worth from the outcome. She had tied her identity to the process, not the result. And because of that, she could weather failure without being defined by it. The truth is, you are not your results. You are not your GPA, your salary, your title, your number of followers, or your profit margin. Those are metrics. They are indicators of where you are, not who you are. The moment we confuse the two, failure becomes unbearable. But when we separate them, failure becomes manageable. You can look at a poor result and say, this didn't work, without saying, I am worthless. Children understand this naturally. A child can try to build a tower of blocks, knock it over, laugh, and start again. They don't say, I'm a bad builder. They say, let's try again. But somewhere along the way, adults stop thinking like that. We start seeing failure as a reflection of who we are instead of what we attempted. And that mindset crushes creativity, innovation, and courage. We live in a culture obsessed with outcomes. We celebrate the wins, the records, the milestones. We rarely celebrate the process, the effort, the perseverance. And because of that, we learn early on that outcomes equal identity. Win the game and you're a champion. Lose it and you're forgotten. But that's not the truth. The truth is, identity is deeper than outcomes. Identity is built on values, character, and resilience, things that don't disappear when you fail. This is why some of the most resilient people in the world are those who've learned to separate themselves from their results. They can fail without being broken. They can succeed without being arrogant. They understand that outcomes are temporary, but identity is permanent. That's what gives them stability in a world where everything else keeps shifting. So how do we do that? How do we detach our identity from the outcome? It begins with language. Instead of saying, I am a failure, say, I experienced a failure. Instead of saying, I am a success, say, I experienced success. It's a subtle shift, but it's powerful. Events are temporary, identity is enduring. And when you remind yourself of that distinction, you stop letting outcomes dictate your self-worth. Another way is to define yourself by values rather than victories. Ask yourself, who am I when the scoreboard is blank? Who am I when nobody is watching? Who am I when the applause fades? If the only answer you can give is tied to outcomes, then you'll always be at the mercy of circumstances. But if your answer is tied to values, integrity, perseverance, kindness, creativity, courage, then failure won't shake you, because values don't vanish when you fall short. They carry you through it. There's a story about a CEO who lost his company in a downturn. Overnight, he went from being admired to being pitied. People whispered behind his back, he failed. For a while, he believed it too. But then he realized something: the company may have failed, but he was still the same person who built it. His vision, his creativity, his ability to rally people, those hadn't disappeared. The outcome had changed, but his identity hadn't. That realization saved him. It gave him the strength to start again. And today he leads another thriving business, built stronger because of what he learned. Detaching identity from outcome doesn't mean we stop caring about results. Of course, results matter. They tell us whether our strategy worked, whether our effort paid off, whether we need to adjust. But they are not the final word on our worth. They are feedback, not judgment. When we see them that way, failure becomes less threatening. It becomes a teacher instead of a tyrant. And here's the irony: when we detach our identity from outcomes, we often achieve better outcomes. Why? Because we stop playing scared. When you believe your worth is tied to success, every decision feels life or death. You play not to lose instead of playing to win. But when you know who you are regardless of the result, you take risks, you innovate, you create, you perform freely because failure no longer defines you. And ironically, that freedom often leads to greater success. So the challenge is this: stop saying, I am my results. Start saying, I am my values, my effort, my resilience. Because when you define yourself by things within your control, your character, your choices, your courage, failure loses its power to define you. You can fail without collapsing. You can succeed without inflating your ego. You can live with stability in a world of uncertainty. The next time you stumble, remember this: you are not your failure. You are the person who had the courage to try. You are the person who can learn, adapt, and try again. And when you succeed, remember this too: you are not your success. You are the person whose values, vision, and persistence made that success possible. Outcomes will come and go. Who you are remains, because at the end of the day, your identity is not up for negotiation. It cannot be taken by failure, and it cannot be proven by success. It is something deeper, something unshackable, something that stands firm regardless of the outcome. And when you finally detach your identity from what happens to you, you'll discover a kind of freedom most people never experience. You'll discover that failure was never the end of you. It was simply the beginning of something new. Every one of us will fall. That's not a prediction, it's a guarantee. Life has a way of testing us, of shaking us, of knocking us off balance at the exact moment we think we've got it all figured out. Failure, loss, disappointment, they don't ask for permission before they arrive. And when they do, the question is never, will I fall? The real question is, who will be there to catch me? We often think strength is about standing alone, about being independent, about carrying the weight by ourselves. But the truth is, no one is strong enough to withstand failure in isolation. Even the most resilient among us eventually break when we try to carry the burden alone. We are wired for connection. We are built to lean on others, the people we surround ourselves with. Our circle determine whether failure becomes the end of the road or just another step along the journey. I once met a man who had started a company that grew faster than he ever imagined. He was celebrated, admired, praised as a visionary. But when the market shifted and the company collapsed, something interesting happened. The praise vanished. The admiration disappeared. People who once called him daily no longer answered his calls. In his words, he said, I didn't just lose my company. I lost my friends. That's what it felt like to him, abandonment. What hurt the most wasn't the business loss. It was discovering that his circle wasn't really a circle. It was a crowd. Crowds cheer when you're winning. Circles stay when you're losing. Now contrast that with another story. A woman I know tried to launch a product that failed publicly. She felt embarrassed, devastated, certain that she had disappointed everyone around her. But instead of silence, she was met with support. Her circle reminded her of her courage, her effort, her willingness to risk something meaningful. They didn't diminish her failure, but they didn't let her drown in it either. They reframed it. They caught her. And because of them, she found the strength to try again. Today, she credits her success not to her own brilliance, but to the people who refused to let her quit when she wanted to. That's the power of a circle. The right people can make failure survivable. They can remind us that we are not defined by a single event, that our worth doesn't vanish because of one mistake, that setbacks are temporary but potential is permanent. Without a circle, failure feels final. With a circle, failure feels like feedback. The fall is the same, but the landing is very different. The problem is too many of us don't invest in building circles. We invest in building audiences. We chase followers, likes, approval. But audiences don't catch you. Audiences clap when you're on stage and then they move on to the next show. A circle doesn't clap, it lifts. It doesn't applaud from a distance. It gets down in the dirt with you when you fall. And that's why the size of your circle matters far less than its depth. You don't need hundreds of people cheering for you. You need a few who will stand with you when everyone else walks away. Think about the people in your life right now. Who are the ones you call when things go wrong? Who are the ones who will tell you the truth when you don't want to hear it? Who are the ones who remind you of your strength when you've forgotten it? Those people are your circle. And if you can't name them, it's not too late to start building them. Building a circle isn't about networking. It's not about collecting business cards or adding contacts. It's about cultivating trust. Trust is built slowly through consistency, honesty, and vulnerability. A true circle is formed when people share not just their successes, but their failures. When they show up for each other in the hard times, not just the good times. That's why circles are rare. They require effort, loyalty, patience, but they are priceless when failure comes. There's a reason some of the most resilient teams in the world are built not on talent, but on trust. In the military, in sports, in organizations that endure hardship, the bond between people is what carries them through. They fall, they stumble, they fail. But because they know the person beside them will not let them stay down, they get back up. Imagine living life with that same kind of circle around you. Imagine facing failure with the confidence that even if you hit the ground, you will not hit it alone. But here's the catch: to have a circle that catches you, you must be willing to catch others. It's not a one-way relationship. Too many people want support without offering it. They want loyalty without giving it. But circles don't work that way. If you want people who will stand by you in failure, you must be the kind of person who stands by others in theirs. That means showing up when it's inconvenient. That means listening when it's messy. That means reminding others of their worth when they've forgotten it. You can't build a circle without investing in it. This is why failure shared is failure softened. When we are willing to say, I messed up, and someone else says, Matu, the shame evaporates. The silence breaks, the isolation disappears, and suddenly the weight of failure doesn't feel unbearable. It feels shared. That doesn't make the failure go away, but it makes it survivable. It makes it meaningful, and it creates a bond stronger than success ever could. Think about your own life. The people you trust most deeply are not the ones who only celebrated your wins. They are the ones who sat with you in your losses. The ones who didn't try to fix everything, didn't try to rush you past the pain, but simply said, I'm here. That's what a circle does. It doesn't eliminate the fall, but it makes sure the fall doesn't destroy you. We live in a culture that glorifies independence, that celebrates the self-made person. But the truth is, nobody is self-made. Every person who has ever achieved anything of significance did so because others lifted them along the way. Behind every great success is a circle that caught someone when they fell. If we really want to build lives of resilience, we must shift our focus from independence to interdependence, from audiences to circles, from standing alone to standing together. So the question isn't, how do I avoid falling? Because you can't. The question is, who will catch me when I do? That question matters more than any strategy, more than any plan, more than any ambition. Because failure will visit us all. The only variable is whether we face it alone or together. The challenge for all of us is this: stop trying to impress crowds and start investing in circles. Stop chasing applause and start building trust. Stop hiding your failures and start sharing them with the people who have earned the right to hear them. Because when you do, you'll discover something powerful. Failure no longer feels like the end. It feels like a chapter you're not reading alone. And here's the most beautiful part: circles don't just catch you when you fall. They remind you that falling is normal. They remind you that failure is not a verdict but a step. They remind you that your worth is unchanged, your potential is intact, and your journey is still unfolding. With a circle, failure loses its power to isolate. With a circle, the fall becomes a place of learning instead of loneliness. At the end of the day, resilience is not about how strong you are alone. It's about how strong your circle is together. Build a circle that catches you when you fall, and you'll discover that failure was never something to fear. It was simply another opportunity for connection, growth, and strength. Because the truth is, we rise higher when we rise together, and we recover faster when we refuse to fall alone. Failure has always carried a reputation it doesn't deserve. Most people look at it as the end, the evidence that they weren't good enough, the closing of a chapter that should never have been written. But that's not what makes failure so painful. What really makes it unbearable is how we treat it like a life sentence instead of a lesson. We convince ourselves that failure is a final verdict, when in reality it is nothing more than a rehearsal. If we can reframe it, we can avoid the worst part of failing altogether. Think about the first time you tried something difficult, maybe when you were a child learning to ride a bike. You didn't stay on for long. You fell, you scraped your knee, and if you're like most kids, you cried a little. But what happened next? You got up, you got back on the bike, you wobbled again, you tried again, and eventually you figured it out. That same fall, in the mind of an adult, might feel like proof that cycling isn't for them, yet as a child it was simply part of the process. What's the difference? perspective. Children haven't yet learned to label failure as something permanent. Adults, on the other hand, attach identity to outcomes. And that is the real danger. Failure is never the problem. The real problem is when we misinterpret failure as the end of the story rather than a page in the book. The worst part of failing is not the fall itself, but the belief that the fall has ended our journey. But here's the truth: every failure is rehearsal. Every failure is feedback. Every failure is a chance to adjust, to improve, to refine. The only people who cannot turn failure into fuel are those who stop moving the moment they fall. When an actor rehearses a scene, they stumble over their lines, they miss their cues, they trip over the stage. Nobody in the rehearsal room points to them and says, "You're a terrible actor, you'll never make it." Instead, they laugh, they reset, and they try again. The mistakes in rehearsal aren't just tolerated, they're necessary. They're the very process by which excellence is born. Yet when the stage of life is in front of us, we forget this. We treat our first attempts as if they are final performances. We expect perfection where rehearsal is required. And when it doesn't come, we decide we're not meant for the role. That is how people turn failure into a verdict instead of fuel. But what happens when you decide to treat failure like rehearsal? Suddenly the fear shifts. Suddenly the stakes aren't so paralyzing. Because rehearsal isn't about getting it right, it's about preparing to get it right. And that's exactly what failure offers us: preparation. Every mistake reveals something we couldn't have known otherwise. Every misstep highlights the gap between where we are and where we want to be. And by seeing failure as rehearsal, we transform it from something that stops us into something that propels us forward. History gives us plenty of reminders. Think of the inventors, scientists, and leaders who are celebrated today. None of them arrived at success without failing, often dramatically. Thomas Edison didn't invent the light bulb on his first try. He conducted thousands of experiments, each one teaching him something new, each one bringing him closer to the solution. When asked about his so-called failures, he didn't call them wasted efforts. He said, "I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." He understood something most of us forget: each failure was rehearsal. Without those missteps, the breakthrough would have been impossible. This same principle applies beyond invention and science. It applies to relationships, to careers, to personal growth. Every awkward conversation, every rejection, every wrong choice and judgment, they are all rehearsals. They prepare us for better conversations, better opportunities, better decisions. They aren't verdicts on who we are. They're lessons shaping who we are becoming. But that perspective requires courage. It requires the willingness to look at failure not as a mirror of your worth, but as a guide to your next step. Imagine two people facing the same setback. One treats it like a verdict. This is proof that I'm not capable. They stop, they retreat, they give up. The other treats it like rehearsal. This is teaching me what doesn't work. Now I know more than I did yesterday. They try again. They adapt. They keep moving. Over time, the second person isn't just luckier, they're stronger, wiser, more resilient. They've learned to turn failure into fuel. And that is what separates those who grow from those who stagnate. The worst part of failing, when left unchecked, is that it convinces you not to try again. It whispers lies. You're not good enough. You should quit. You don't belong. But those whispers lose their power the moment you choose to reframe failure. If you see it as rehearsal, then every mistake becomes evidence that you're in the process of becoming. The story doesn't end with a fall. It begins there. The world is filled with people who let failure define them, and it's also filled with those who let failure refine them. The ones who rise are not the ones who avoided mistakes, but the ones who turn mistakes into motion. They refuse to let failure be a verdict. They chose to see it as practice. And so the question is not, how do I avoid failing? The question is, how do I use failing? How do I let it sharpen me, strengthen me, teach me? Because you will fail. That's not in question. What is in question is how you interpret it. Do you let it stop you, or do you let it fuel you? Do you treat it as the end or as rehearsal for something greater? Here's the irony: the people we admire most are not the ones who never fell, but the ones who kept rising. The leaders, innovators, and creators who inspire us are not perfect, but persistent. They stumbled just like the rest of us, but instead of stopping, they kept rehearsing until the performance of their lives was ready. So if you want to avoid the worst part of failing, you have to make a choice. You have to decide that failure will never be your final verdict. You have to choose to treat it as rehearsal. You have to remember that every mistake holds a lesson, every setback holds an opportunity, every fall holds the possibility of rising stronger. When you do, the fear fades, the shame shrinks, the silence breaks, and failure becomes what it was always meant to be, fuel for the journey. Because at the end of the day, the worst part of failing isn't the failure itself. It's forgetting that failure was never the end. It was only rehearsal for something greater.